Hey YouTube, I decided to do a video on atheism, and the reason why is because it's pretty much a dead world view that doesn't have the common courtesy of laying down, and a lot of this has to do with my interactions with atheists online. They don't seem to think that they need arguments. They don't really want to participate in debate, and it just seems like this weird social group that's gotten out of hand. So I'm going to expose some of the weaknesses that they have in interacting with theists. The first problem you're going to run into is defining atheism. And it's pretty much a game they play so they can sort of define themselves out of a debate. They don't want to have any sort of epistemic burden. So let's play the atheist shell game. So let's try to define what an atheist is. Is an atheist, one, a lack of a belief? Two, agnosticism. Three, Buddhism. Four, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Or five, a disbelief in God. Well, if you guessed five, you are correct. Anything less would be completely ridiculous. Anyways, so first of all, this lack of belief nonsense. Um, Technically, if that's what it means, then my dog is an atheist. It's not a very useful definition. Um, and you can't lack a belief in something that you're familiar with. So this is basically intellectual cowardice. I don't take any of these people seriously. If they just say they lack a belief, I just, pretty much walk away. And then there's agnosticism, which doesn't have anything to do with atheism. Agnosticism, if somebody says they're an agnostic atheist, what they're basically saying is, I don't know crap, but I'm an atheist. Or I have faith in atheism. So they're conflating knowledge with belief, which is pretty much incoherent. So if somebody says they're an agnostic atheist, they're probably going to ask you a lot of questions and stuff like that. They don't have any arguments. Then they're going to fall back on this idea that they're an agnostic. Which is just kind of silly. If they're really an agnostic atheist, they should be open to the existence of God, but that's just a silly position they take. Anyway, so we'll skip Buddhism and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. But I'd like to point out that being an atheist doesn't necessarily mean you don't believe in spirituality or any of those other things. I mean, technically, Buddhists, astrologers, witches, warlocks, Scientologists, they're all atheists with respect to belief in God, but they can believe in all kinds of other sort of nonsense. Let's move on. The next slide I'm going to point out is about metaphysics and epistemology. So there's really no way to debate formally or in a sort of rigorous way unless you have at least some basic understanding of philosophy. So the existence or non-existence of God is a metaphysical question. It doesn't have anything to do with science. A lot of times atheists will say, I believe in science. Okay, that's great. But it has nothing to do with atheism, and it has nothing to do with metaphysics, so that's just irrelevant. And I think what they're basically trying to do here is they're trying to take the prestige of science and act as though it has something to do with atheism, so they're more credible or something like that. So metaphysics is basically about what exists and what is its nature. Epistemology is basically, what can we know and how do we know it. Traditionally, and I would say for the most part, there's two different theories about how we derive knowledge. One's called empiricism and the other's called rationalism. Empiricism says that we derive all knowledge from our sensory experience, whereas the rationalist says that we derive knowledge from our thinking, logic, and things that are basically true by definition. I think this is a false dichotomy. I think we have to rely on not only our thoughts about the world, but also our experiences with the world. So the interesting thing about this position, this empiricism, is they empiricists say, well, I only, trust what I see. Something like, I believe what I can see because I can see it. The problem is this position is lacking in the sense that in order to have observations in the first place, you have to have consciousness and the mind, which are not capable of being observed. So, make sense of that what you will. So, and a lot of people have a sort of negative perception of philosophy. It's not a bunch of stoned Greek guys sitting around talking about abstract thoughts. It's basically the root of most of our knowledge. But if you're going to interact with an atheist, just remember, don't get distracted by their comments about how they believe in science, because it's not relevant. Okay, debate. Now, I'm defining a debate as a formal discussion in which opposing arguments are put forward. So atheists will try to take the position that atheism is the default position when that's not reality. Agnosticism is. Agnosticism comes in two forms. One is, if somebody says, I'm an agnostic, what they're basically saying is they don't know whether God exists or not. It's a claim of ignorance. I just don't know. Whereas other agnostics are a little more bold, and they'll say human beings in general don't have the capacity to comprehend God or these sort of metaphysical questions. So that's basically called an ornery agnostic. And when you're interacting with someone, especially in debate, you have to be careful with language. In logic, first type of logic you learn is propositional logic, which is the logic of sentences. And so if you're interacting with an atheist and they use subjective language like I believe, I think, whatever, or if they ask questions or exclamations or any of these things, none of this stuff is true or false. It's not capable of being true or false. A proposition is a declarative sentence that has a truth value. So if they were to say something like, God doesn't exist, that's a proposition. The problem is the person making the claim has to back up the claim. And if they're not willing to do that, then they're just playing games with you. So they'll say, God doesn't exist. And you'll say, prove it. And they'll turn around and say, well, show me evidence. Okay, this is ridiculous. You make a claim, you back it up. Otherwise, you're not a serious person. And when I say here that atheists don't have a coherent metaphysical position, I have to sort of qualify that. So atheists, generally speaking, are materialists. I think you can go all the way back to an ancient Greek philosopher by the name of Democritus. He's quoted as saying, the only thing that exists is atoms in the void. So he was an atomist, and he thought atoms were the basic constituent of reality. That's been falsified, but atheists, generally speaking, believe that. And there's another problem which has its roots in the history of science, where science basically came out of philosophy, and one of the aspects of science is mechanistic philosophy. And so early on, during the Enlightenment period, or during the period of Isaac Newton and some other great scientists, they believed that the only way to have an explanation of some phenomenon was to have this notion of causality, where you had to have physical contact between two bodies, physical interaction. But Isaac Newton ran into a problem right away, and he realized that he would never be able to understand what he called action at a distance. So if you're trying to understand gravity, for example, you cannot have a reductionist understanding of gravity. And he was really troubled by this. But what science did was science lowered its criteria. The scientific establishment basically said that we have to lower the standards of intelligibility from reductionism to unification. So what that means is science has models of the universe or some phenomenon, but it's not claiming to have a reductionist explanation of such phenomenon. Electromagnetism would be one example of unification, where you have a couple of different phenomenon under one umbrella, even though they are related. So the point I'm trying to make here is, along with this sort of materialistic, reductionistic perspective of science, they also adopted a lot of the metaphors that go along with that. So atheists will say the universe is like a big clock, some big deterministic clock. Animals, living organisms are like machines, and of course brains are much like computers, which sort of developed later. And some people still have that sort of same perception of reality, that it's very much like a machine, or something like that. Anyway, so atheism often tries to take this position that their position is correct unless proven false. They're innocent until proven guilty. But atheism has to stand on its own merit, and the reason why is just based on logic. Even if it were the case that all the arguments in favor of God failed, atheists would still need an argument for their position. Because, they try to word this as atheism is a disbelief in God, but it's the same as saying, I believe God doesn't exist. So you can just reword the sentence. And since they have this position that they believe God doesn't exist, they have to have some argument for that. So anyway, let's move on. All right. Now I'm going to get into some of the ideas that atheists believe in. They're selectively critical towards what theists believe, but not what they believe. When it comes to what a theist believes, they want, physical evidence, direct observation. They want good arguments, all this other stuff. But when it comes to stuff they believe in, they don't need any of that. So you're looking at abiogenesis here, which is the idea that life came from non-life. Apparently a bunch of amino acids were sitting around and they got bored, so they decided to self-assemble, and here we are. But there is no evidence for any of this. There's no observation that they've ever made. It's just part of their worldview. Now I've looked at the RNA world hypothesis, and I don't think that it's capable of being true or false. But they often complain about people that argue for intelligent design, for example. And the thing is that this is an empirical argument, right? It's based on an observation. Science and philosophy are supposed to be open to new ideas, criticisms, things like that. This is how this process works. But they get all upset and they say, well, that's not science and stuff like that. But they're basically conflating science with metaphysics when they do that. But I would agree, there might be some people out there that believe in intelligent design that might actually think it is science or something, and I think that would be false. So another interesting part about this is I read a book by an atheist. His name's Thomas Nagel. It's called Mind and Cosmos. I think it's a really good book. But in there he argued that with existing methods we have in physics, we don't even have the potential of having a description for life. And one of the reasons for that is that physics it needs to be capable of describing what actually exists in the world. So part of what exists would be consciousness, mind, meaning, language, whatever. And so there would have to be a theory of everything, if there was such a thing. It would have to actually describe what does exist. But atheists want to act like, say, the mind is not something important or useful. It's just basically steam from the brain or something like that. And that's not a serious position. I mean, what he says is, the mind is not just a problem, a localized problem. It's a problem that pervades our whole understanding of the cosmos. The mind is something that helps us to understand everything there is in the world. It's not just something that you can belittle and say that's just some sort of leftover part of evolution or something like that. This is something that's part of a central problem. So Descartes warned against this, but I think empiricists want to reduce everything to physics, and yet they don't want to account for the things that allow us to do physics in the first place, which is the mind. Anyway, so let's move on to the next slide. So there's this age-old argument between those that believe we make choices and those that don't. I think atheists assume that human beings are merely physical objects. And if you have that assumption, I would, think it's logical to think that we're just a bunch of, I don't know, purposeless meat puppets or something like that. But I think that their concept of human beings is very reductive and false, as I have alluded to before. But since they can't if you think about it, if we're just physical objects, it doesn't make any sense that matter can resist matter or matter can make decisions. But for whatever reason, they they rely on their cognitive faculties to provide them with truth, according to them. But apparently they can't decide what is true. And if you think about it for a minute, I think the best description of free will I got was from someone called Ayn Rand. And I don't particularly care for her, but I liked her description. And she said free will is the ability to focus on one thought at the expense of another thought, or to act upon a thought or not to act upon a thought. And a lot of times people, if you reflect on it for a second, you realize you don't actually choose your thoughts. You just choose which thoughts to focus on, but I'll let you go ahead and think about that to yourself. But there's often people that conflate free will with free choice. So what they'll say is, you didn't choose where you were born, you didn't choose your parents, you didn't choose your sex, all these things. It's totally irrelevant to the issue of whether or not you have free will. Not to mention, if free will is an illusion, I don't know what determinism is if free will is an illusion. But whenever we try to do something, especially things that are hard, it's very difficult. So we can feel how difficult it is for us to actualize ourselves sometimes in some environments. But if free will is an illusion, why does the illusion come with the difficulty? Why don't things just happen with lubricated ease? I guess it's a mystery. Anyway, this is their argument. And as you can see, it's basically circular. They're assuming, first, human beings are physical objects. 2, physical objects don't have free will, and thus human beings have no free will. But this is just a circular argument, so it's fallacious. Anyway, the next is their concept of the self. Now, most people believe that the concept is sort of like there's a ghost in the machine. You have a subjective sense of yourself that's different than your sense of your physical body, right? You feel that there's something about you as an individual, as a self. As a theist, I believe I have a soul and a spirit, and I have this self in me that's different than my physical body. Atheists deny that even exists. So, in a sense, I think what they're doing is they're arguing that they don't exist. It doesn't make sense to me to think that you can have an identity as just a physical organ like the brain, and if you get into the philosophy of this, it just becomes completely retarded. Anyway, but there's something called the no-self doctrine in Buddhism, where Buddha says, basically, you can't point at something specific and say that's the self, so there is no self. Though that's like me, walking into Walmart and saying I can't point at some particular object, so there's no Walmart. That's just an irrational argument. But I don't know if Buddha was an empiricist or something. I don't have any reason to believe that, but I disagree with this whole no self doctrine. If there's anything I know for sure is that I exist as a self, that I'm conscious, that I'm having subjective experiences, that I have free will. If any of these things are false, then I can't pretty much know anything. So brains are irrational. C.S. Lewis said once that it's incoherent to think that you could get rationality from that which is irrational, and by that he meant nature. I think Alvin Plantinga also had an argument. Given naturalism and given the theory of evolution, it's very unlikely that you'd be able to rely on your cognitive faculties to give you truth, because our cognitive faculties would have been geared more towards survival than truth. And also, I think atheists have this notion that despite cognitive science having tons of evidence to the contrary, excuse me, they have this idea that causality is unidirectional with respect to the brain and the mind. So they feel that the brain causes whatever occurs in the mind, even though they say it's the same thing. It depends on who you talk to. But there's lots of evidence to show that the mind also causally influences the brain. And so for whatever reason, they believe in science, but when it contradicts their beliefs, they're not interested in science so much. Anyway, so this is an argument that I'm demonstrating here that shows that the mind and the brain are different things. You can look at this if you want. I think I'm going to leave the comment section open on this video, so if you have any questions about this argument, I'd be happy to go over it. Okay, the magic of emergence. This is a word that atheists like to use when they can't explain something. So if you think about it, what they're saying is, with respect to consciousness, is it's just a byproduct of the brain. So what they're saying is something that was physical, right, that wasn't conscious, for whatever reason, it didn't have the property of consciousness. It just emerged, like, abracadabra, pixie dust, magic, whatever. This is just not an explanation of anything. This is not a description of, how consciousness came about. But they think just saying the word emergence is a way out of explaining consciousness. And this is kind of the problem I have with atheism, is that, okay, fine, you don't believe in God and stuff like that, but aren't you intellectually curious at all? I mean, it would seem to me that it would be irresponsible not to consider who you are or what you are as an individual, try to understand things like consciousness, try to understand what concepts are, what ideas are, things like this. But they don't seem to be focused on any of that stuff. They're more focused on attacking people that have a belief in God or religion and not accounting for what actually exists in the world. Anyway, so let's move on. Morality is subjective, and that's my subjective opinion. For whatever reason, I don't think that morality necessarily has anything to do with God's existence, although I think it would be an interesting feature of human beings if we can, if our moral intuitions are correct, and that we're moral beings. I think, an honest question would be, why is that the case? Why are we moral beings? Why are we different than other animals or something like that? So I think that's the motivation to deny that morality is objective, even though I think the vast majority of atheists that are philosophers believe in moral objectivism, also called moral realism. But I think the new atheists, or the sort of village atheists out there that you're going to encounter online, believe that morality, they're moral skeptics. It depends on what kind of moral skepticism. But the bottom line is, it's kind of interesting that I think a lot of the atheists that are philosophers that believe morality is objective believe that there are these certain sort of platonic abstract entities that help us ground our morals. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that. But so they're basically using a circular argument. They say morality is subjective, and then they turn around and say, well, if it's not subjective, prove that it's not subjective. Again, they're playing this game where all of their beliefs are just true by definition, and there's no questioning them. You have to, You have to convince them on every subject that you're right and they're wrong, and they don't have any debate. So if you go in and you say, look, I believe morality is objective, it doesn't make any sense that it's subjective, this moral skepticism is just ridiculous, not to mention they're always complaining about stuff or whatever, but they don't seem to think that they need an argument for their moral subjectivism. They think that the default position is that morality is subjective, and that's just the way it is. Anyway, and I pointed out that morality is defined as what you ought to do independent of your preferences. So you might be talking to a moral nihilist or something, and they say it's all preference. If you're talking to a moral relativist, this is basically a contradiction, because they'll be basically saying that what was to the Nazis, what they did was morally good, but for us it was morally bad. And basically they're saying that something could be good and bad simultaneously, and that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Anyway, this is an argument for moral realism that I got from Cuneo, and I can respond to anybody that has a problem with this argument. But I thought it was kind of an interesting argument. One of the things that people rely on when it comes to science or debate or something like that is that we follow certain rules. There's a guy named Inspiring Philosophy. If you find his channel on YouTube, he gets into this debate and he gets into moral realism, and I think he does a really good job. So I'm not going to get into that debate now, but I think this is a pretty good, pretty interesting argument for moral realism. And then I'm just going to close on this video. I guess I'll just read this. In order for atheism to be relevant to a debate about reality, they're going to need a coherent metaphysical framework and an epistemology. Atheists claim that the universe always exists or came from nothing. They deny the existence of free will, moral objectivity, minds, God, and anything they can't explain. I would think that any reasonable person would give more thought to their existence than to jump into a social group merely to attack others' beliefs. If not, they're not any better than the religious fundamentalists they criticize. So I think that there's more to life than just attacking other people's beliefs. I think that if we interact with atheists or people that are even from a different religion than ours, we should be able to have civil discussion. We should be able to have arguments with substance, things like that. And anyone that's not interested in engaging in logic and is always burden shifting upon you is somebody that's not worth your time. So anyway, I know this wasn't a great video. I just wanted to put something up on YouTube, and I'm going to try to do a video subsequent to this that'll be visually a little more appealing, and maybe the narration will be a little bit better, but I just sort of improvised this as I went through it. So thanks for watching.